Oh, today we have a fun one with the recent release of the Sony FX30 that you are looking at right now, and also the release of the ZV-E10 and a bunch of APS-C lenses. It is clear that the Sony APS-C system is alive and well. But with all of those lens options that are now out there, begs the question, which ones should you buy? Because you gotta buy some lenses. You can't have a camera without any lenses. So let's talk about it. So I'm going to break this down into chunks to keep it simple. My wife, she says that about me, that I'm a simpleton, and I believe that is a term of endearment. But I'm going to talk about wide-angle lenses, I'm going to talk about studio lenses, I'm going to talk about general purpose lenses, and also telephoto lenses. And we'll see which one you need in each category. Now, if you use some APS-C lenses that I haven't mentioned on the list for some reason, feel free to write it in the comments below, and then I will respectfully disagree with you, or maybe not even respectfully disagree with you. I've also reviewed most of the lenses I'm talking about in depth. I will leave a link to the reviews, so you can just, click on those links, watch Camera Crisis all day, have a whole party with Camera Crisis. Kick that algorithm in the butt for me, will ya? And also in this video, I'm going to stick to all autofocus lenses. I will do other videos where I will include manual focus lenses, but one of the great things about having Sony cameras is that beautiful autofocus. So let's stick with the autofocus lenses, and these will also be all APS-C specific lenses, I think, except for one. I will do another video about proper full-frame lenses that will jive well with your APS-C Sony cameras. But right now, APS-C lenses, autofocus lenses, let's go. So first up, we will talk about the wide-angle lenses. Now, these lenses are going to be good for the people that like the vlogging, they like the walking and the talking. A lot of people like that these days. These lenses are going to be good for that. They're also going to be good for landscape photography, for architectural, is that a word? For photography and videography about architecture, and also good for astrophotography. Wide-angle lenses with lower f-stops are good for astrophotography as well. Let's not forget about the real estate people. You want a wide lens to make that bathroom look extra big. Trick those people who are coming to the showing. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the one I've been waving around in my hand here, and that is the 11mm 1.8 from Sony. This, to me, is the best vlogging lens that you can buy for the system, just because look at the size of this. It is so small and light, and it fits very well on a gimbal if you want to do that. Look at this. This is the Zhiyun Crane M2S, the smallest gimbal I have ever owned, and the little ZV-E10 and the 11mm fits on this just great, so that's a huge bonus. This lens is great optically. It has no focus breathing, chromatic aberrations controlled well, so is flare and ghosting. It's got that 1.8, so it's pretty good in low light, and this is it's such a wide angle lens that it's really great for close-up video or photography, and you want to take, architecture or landscapes, also very good for this. And I will show you what it looks like if you were hand-holding it vlogging. Man, oh man, this lens is a joy to use when it comes to the old vlogging. I'm using the 11mm right here. I'm also doing a 10% crop in Catalyst Browse. That's a free software. In case you don't know, the FX30 and the ZV-E10, they record gyroscopic data. You can run that data through the free program Catalyst Browse, and then you get this gimbal-like footage without a gimbal. But that is an extra step. If you wanted to use the active stabilization on the FX30, you're going to get this field of view as well. It won't be quite as smooth as this, but if you did want to use the active stabilization on the little ZV-E10, you get this. A mighty big crop. It's about a 40% crop here, and as you can see, it is still quite usable with the 11mm because it is so wide. So in my opinion, that is what makes this the best vlogging lens that you can get for the Sony system. And this is the full field of view that you can get with the 11mm, as long as you put it on a little gimbal like I have here. This is the Zhiyun Crane M2S, a very small, lightweight gimbal, paired very nicely with the ZV-E10 and the 11mm. Look at this footage, so smooth. Nice little bit of a background separation at 1.8. A gorgeous subject. Could life get any better? So there you go. Even with that 40% crop of the ZV-E10, the 11mm still gives you plenty of room. Overall, if you are going to do a ton of handheld vlogging, I think the 11mm is the way to go. So this is the 11mm here in the studio. It's in the exact same place that I had my 16mm, and you see what a difference that makes. You think 5mm doesn't sound like a lot? Look at this. I have to suck in my gut now, and you can see my whole life. You don't need to see this. See, look at that. I'm still touching the lens right here. So for me, this is too wide for the studio. Now, if I was using the ZV-E10, I would probably use active stabilization at this point because that will crop in 40% and that would make more sense to me. So that is one of the ways you could use this lens in the studio. If you have a ZV-E10, you just crop in at 40% and Bob's your uncle. However, a lens that you can use in the studio and also for vlogging is the 13mm f1.4 from Viltrox. Overall, this is one of my favorite lenses in the whole world. Optically, it is stupendous. It is so sharp, and it's got a 1.4 aperture, so it's great in low light. This thing is fantastic for astrophotography because it's so wide and it's got such a bright aperture. It has pretty much no chromatic aberration. Its focus breathing is well controlled, flaring, ghosting, well controlled. It's built so well. It's got an aperture ring. It's smooth. You can't click it or declick it, but it does have an aperture ring. And this thing is absolutely fantastic in every way. So you can take nice wide photos. You can also take some nice wide video. Here is what it looks like if you are out vlogging with this lens. So this is the 13mm Viltrox here with the 10% crop on catalyst brows. And this is about the same crop that you would see if you were using this on the FX30 with active steady shot. But if we use active steady shot on the ZV-E10, here's what you get. You get about a 40% crop. It is definitely also not as smooth, but the Viltrox, because it is quite wide, this is still a usable vlogging length, and it is a vlogging length that I have used many a time. This is the 13mm right here on a gimbal. This is my Zhiyun Crane M3. I had to use a bigger gimbal than the M2S, but it's still quite a small compact gimbal, and you get that full field of view of the 13mm and that nice smooth footage. It's an extra step, of course, to balance a gimbal, but I really love the results of this. And like I said, you can use it in the studio, so let's take a look at that now. So this is the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 here in Handsome Studios, and as you can see, this is a fine studio lens. I could just move this in a couple of inches. I left it there where my Sigma 16 was, so I just left the camera where it is. I just changed the lens, and I could just move this in a couple of inches, and then I would get the exact same framing, really, and it doesn't look too distorted there. My face doesn't look too distorted sitting this close to the lens. I don't look much like a horse. Well, not much more like a horse than my regular face. This could definitely be a great studio lens for you as well. So if you wanted a vlogging lens / studio lens, the Viltrox 13mm is a very strong contender. So now I've moved the Viltrox in just a few inches to get a similar field of view that I get from my Sigma 16mm f1.4. There's still enough space between me and my camera where it is not super uncomfortable. The lens is right here. It is about 1.5 feet away. This gives me enough clearance for the tripod legs and my chair right here. So there. Pretty good. I like this. Now we'll talk about a couple of zooms. The first zoom is the Tamron 11-20 f2.8. Overall, this is the most versatile of the wide angle lenses for the Sony system because you can go from all the way down to 11, all the way up to 20, which is quite a good range. You could use it for vlogging on the 11mm and you can all zoom it in. You could use it in the studio because it has an f2.8. I don't like going past f2.8. I like 2.8 or brighter for the studio, but 2.8 it does have. The 11-20, it has a little bit of focus breathing, so that is one of the drawbacks of the 11-20, and it does extend when you are zooming, so if you have it on a gimbal, that's going to throw off the balance a little bit. Although if you keep it on the same focal length and you set up your gimbal fine, and say if you put it at the 11mm and just leave it there, set it up on your gimbal, then it can work just fine. You can also use the active steady shot that is in the FX30 or the ZV-E10, and you will still have lots of room to see the background behind you. That 2.8 is going to give you a little bit of background blur, and this is it's a sharp lens. It's a great lens, and if you're going to take a ton of wide angle photos, I think this is the best lens to get. Now there is another wide angle zoom lens which could also be great for you depending on what you shoot, and that is the Sony 10-20 Power Zoom F4. Now that F4 is not going to be fantastic in low light. You are not going to get a lot of background separation at F4 on an APS-C camera, but the lens, if you want to shoot architecture and landscapes, which is what a lot of people do when they're using wide angle lenses, you're often shooting at f8 or above, so the f4 doesn't make a difference at all, and this small lens is so light and so well balanced that it can go on a gimbal. It can actually go on the Zhiyun Crane M2S as well with the little ZV-E10. So if you don't mind that f4 and you're out vlogging in the daytime, then it could be a great lens to vlog with as well. So if you take a lot of landscape and architectural photography and you want a good gimbal lens, you don't mind that f4, then the 10 to 20 may be the way to go because it has great optics. Its focus breathing is just not there, and good chromatic aberration, ghosting, flare control. A lot of the lenses I'm talking about are excellent lenses. So this is definitely an excellent performer. It's just you have to decide whether or not that f4 is good for you. Now there is an older Sony wide zoom lens, and that is the 10 to 18 f4, and that lens is just, it's not quite the performer that these other lenses I mentioned. It's a little bit softer. However, that is still a good lens, and it's actually optically stabilized. So if you don't have an FX30 or a ZV-E10 with that active stabilization, let's say you have the a6400, then the lens stabilization of that 10 to 18 is probably going to be good for you. It's just that I find with the active steady shot on the FX30 and the ZV-E10, the optical stabilization doesn't do much, if anything, at all. So I wouldn't buy that lens for the optical stabilization, unless, of course, you have a camera that has no stabilization and you don't plan to use a gimbal. In that case, then the 10 to 18 f4 might work for you, but again, it's a bit older and optically not quite as good as the newer releases. Now there is also a Samyang 12mm f2, which is a nice small lens, and it's an autofocus lens, but it's just that it falls a fair bit behind all of the other lenses I mentioned in terms of optical performance. It has quite a lot of flare and ghosting. The autofocus is slow at times, and I find that it can't focus very well in low light situations, and the lens itself is not that sharp. So if you can find a really good deal on one, it definitely could fill a role for you if you wanted to, say, use it as a vlogging lens. But if you want to take really sharp photos and things like that, and you want really good optical quality, then I would opt for one of the other lenses. So now let's talk about those studio lenses. When I say studio lenses, I mean things like this: talking head stuff, you're doing interviews, you're inside, you have some lights set up, you want the camera a reasonable distance away from you, then I think the Sony 15mm f1.4, one of the best options that you can buy. It is overall the best lens that I have ever tested for the APS-C system. It's just, its build quality is so great. It's got an aperture ring that's clicky or declicky. It's got a focus hold button. It's got a great focus throw. Optically, it is magnificent. There's no focus breathing, no chromatic aberration, ghosting, flare, well controlled. It is just such an excellent performer. And it's also so small and light that you can run it on the smallest gimbals that you have. It is just, but with that perfection comes a price, and right now I think it is $746, which is pretty pricey for an APS-C prime lens. But you know, if you have the budget for it, you really can't do much better than the Sony 15mm f1.4. And to get this type of shot right here from my burly chest to the top of my pretty head, then you're going to want to be about 2 feet away from the camera. I am about 2 feet away right now because I'm using a 16mm Sigma f1.4. Let's talk about that next. The 16mm f1.4 from Sigma is the best bargain of any lens in any system, period. This thing, it's optically as good as the 15mm from Sony, which I just said is the best lens that I have ever tested. This lens is so great. It focuses instantly. It has virtually no focus breathing, chromatic aberration, the Loca, whatever you want to throw at it, this thing can do. Low light situations, it still focuses. No matter what you do, this lens will perform, and it is less than half the price of the Sony 15mm. You can get this usually for about $350, and it is my #1 recommendation to all people who want to do interview type styles or like YouTube talking head things. I always say go with the Sigma 16mm f1.4 because you don't have to worry about the size and the weight of it. You don't need the buttons or the apertures or any of those things because it's over here on my tripod. So no big deal, and that's why I got this instead of the 15mm from Sony. But it is bigger and heavier than the 15mm, and it has no bells and whistles on the lens. So if you're going to be taking this out into the wild a lot, you know, that 15mm with the aperture ring and its nice size, that is going to pay some dividends, and it might be worth that price upgrade if you're not just keeping this lens on a tripod. So this is the field of view of the Sigma 16mm if you do a 10% crop on catalyst browse, or if you use the active stabilization on the FX30. Now, if you wanted to use the active stabilization on the ZV-E10, what you get is a very uncomfortable crop. You don't want to be this close. I mean, I know some of you aren't complaining, but it is my job to entertain and to educate, not to make the ladies swoon. So, you know, you want your camera and your lens to not be so tight in on your mug. That is why I don't use the Sigma 16mm with the active steady shot on the ZV-E10. Now, if you were so inclined to use a gimbal like the Crane M3 here by Zhiyun again, then you can use the 16mm and have a pretty good focal length when it comes to vlogging. But I think that the gimbal is a necessity in this case due to the fact that it's just too tight otherwise, even with a 10% crop on catalyst browse. Now, if you're looking for a focal length that's more like a 35mm field of view, where the camera is going to be about 4 feet away from you to get this type of shot, then you can look at the Viltrox 23mm f1.4. This is a great lens. It lets in a lot of light. It's good at autofocusing, and it's a sharp lens. It's not a perfect lens. It's not as good really as the Sigma 16 or the Sony 15, but if you need that extra space, you know, for your shot, if you want a 35mm field of view, the Viltrox definitely could be a good option. Now, there is a Sony 24mm f1.8, a Zeiss lens that is quite a bit older. You may not be able to find that anymore. If you can find a used deal on that, that is still a great lens. It optically performs quite well, and you will get about a 36mm full frame equivalent in terms of your field of view. So that is still a good option if you can find a deal on it, but at full retail price, it is much more expensive than the Viltrox 23mm that is an f1.4. So there you go. If you're asking me for the studio, I would do the Sony 15mm or the Sigma 16mm f1.4. Pick your treat. So now I'll talk about the mid-range or maybe general purpose lenses. I'll start with one prime lens, and that is the Sigma 30mm f1.4. This lens is crazy cheap. You can usually find it for less than $300, and that's a 1.4 for $300 or less, and it's got a field of view of about 45mm full frame equivalents, which is kind of representative of what the human eye sees. So if you want things to look natural, if you want to travel and capture what you see, the 30mm is great. It's also great for street photography, and it's wonderful to use on a gimbal. It is so sharp. You get so much background blur, so much bokeh. You could do portraits as well with this. At 45mm, it's not a bad portrait lens, just a very great lens with great optics that is so cheap. I can't see why someone wouldn't pick it up. And if you have enough room in your studio to put your camera about 5 feet away, it could be a brilliant studio lens as well. So if your room is big enough, you know, to me, it's a bit of a pain because I like to be able to lean over, touch the camera, change the settings if I want. But if you don't mind putting the camera over 5 feet from you, it could be a great studio lens. And now when it comes to the zooms, I'll mention the kit lens first. And the kit lens is it's a versatile lens. It's a good range from 16 to 50, but that variable aperture of 3.5 to 5.6, it isn't great, and optically it isn't great, but it is a jack of all trades. I mean, you can get portraits at the 50mm focal length. You can even do some vlogging and some close-up video work at the 16mm focal length, and it's still a useful lens, and I find myself using it more than I thought I would. It's more than just a backup lens. I often use it as a second or a third angle. And it's so small and light, and it's got the power zoom function, so you can move that with the toggle of the ZV-E10 or the FX30, and you can also do the power zoom with a remote as well, which is very handy sometimes when you can't get near the lens and you can just use a remote, zoom it in and out. So you will probably want to upgrade from the kit lens eventually, but I thought I would mention it because I do use it. And if it's the only lens that you have because you bought the kit with the ZV-E10, you can still get great work out of it. It's just, you know, this video is more about the lenses you will upgrade from the kit lens. You know what, I will show you the kit lens on my little gimbal here because you can use it with the inexpensive Zhiyun Crane M2S, very lightweight setup, and since it's on a gimbal and you have no crop, you do have a decent field of view when it comes to vlogging. And the perfect upgrade to the kit lens is the 18-50 2.8 from Sigma. My goodness, this is a wonderful lens. It's so sharp. It's so great. It's so cute and light, and I love it. It's one of my favorite looking lenses. It feels really great to hold it, but more importantly, it performs exceptionally well. It is just such a nice lens to shoot with. Your pictures, they come out so great. This could be your everyday walk around lens. You never have to take it off if you don't want. You're going on a trip, traveling, that 18-50 with that 2.8, that constant 2.8, absolutely fantastic. And for the price, I think it's $549 right now. And I mean, that is just a steal for a 2.8 constant 18-50 APS-C. That really equates to about a 27 to 75 f2.8 of light all the way through. Of course, it will be 4.2 in terms of full frame background blur, but in terms of light, it is still a 2.8. And this lens has a trick up its sleeve, and that is macro photography. You can focus at about 12 centimeters, so you can really get some great macro shots with this lens. So if you are looking for a lens that can shoot some macro photography, then you could get this lens, which is inexpensive, and also it's a lot less expensive than most macro lenses, and you will have a very versatile regular focal length of the 18-50. It is just a high recommendation for a general purpose shooter. Another big recommendation is the Tamron 17-70 f2.8. 2.8 all the way through from 17 to 70. Huge focal range to have 2.8 all the way through. Fantastic. Again, you could just stick this on your camera and never take it off. You could use it for studio work. You could go out and shoot portraits. You could do whatever you want with this lens. It is such a great workhorse, and it has the VC. It has the vibration control of the Tamron, which is their optical stabilization. That is what they call it. So you have an optically stabilized lens as well. The drawback to this guy is he is more expensive than the 18-50, and he is bigger and heavier than the 18-50. So a little less travel friendly. So you have to pay a little bit more, and you have to lug around a bigger lens, but boy, a lot of versatility there. Now there is one more constant 2.8 zoom lens, and that is the Sony 16-55 2.8, and that is definitely optically a great lens, but that is bonkers expensive. That is $1,400 new, and I mean, that is like the price of G Master lenses, so I can't recommend spending $1,400 on that APS-C zoom range when it's much cheaper to get, say, the Tamron 17-70 lens or the Sigma 18-50. So while optically great, way too expensive. Now let's move on to portrait lenses. You won't be taking video at this type of focal length. This is for basically head and shoulder shots. You know, if you want head shots for clients and stuff, you want that really nice blurry background. There's really only one lens that I would strongly recommend, and that is the Sigma 56mm f1.4. The Sigma 56 1.4 is one of the sharpest lenses in history, and it takes such fantastic photos. Here's a picture right now, 56mm 1.4 with the Sony ZV-E10 versus the A7 IV and an 85mm f1.8. So just a fraction of the price, and yet look at the quality. It holds up. It's almost identical when you look at the picture of this random woman who walks near my house. She walks around like she owns the place, this lady, but just look at how close these two images are. So that 56mm f1.4, it is just, if you want to take portraits, that is the lens to get. Now, you could save a little bit of money and get the Viltrox 56mm f1.4, and that is still a good lens. It's just not as good as the Sigma 56mm f1.4. And then the full frame, this is the only full frame lens I will mention, the Sony 50mm f1.8 full frame. It's just because it's so cheap, and it can get you that same similar field of view. So it would be about a 75mm field of view in terms of full frame equivalents. So you could still definitely use that for portrait lenses. But again, that is just if you really need to save money and you don't want to take a lot of portraits. If you take a lot of portraits, get the 56 from Sigma. You will not regret that. Telephoto. Now, my major recommendation for the telephoto lens category is the Tamron 18-50 to 300. Do you hear that? 18 to 300. That is the full frame equivalent of $27 to $450 for $699. And at f3.5 on the wide end at 18 millimeters, you could even use that for the studio. It's pushing it, in my opinion, but you could get away with a f3.5 18 millimeters. It's just, you talk about versatility. My goodness, 18 to 300. That is just $699. To me, if you're gonna have a telephoto lens, you want that long reach, just get that lens. Unless you don't think you're going to need much past the 100 millimeter focal length, which would be 150 millimeter full frame equivalent. Then in that case, you could get the Sony 18 to 105 f4 power zoom, because you can get that for about $650. Very versatile lens, f4 all the way through, so it's not fantastic in low light, but that is a good focal range at a good price to get from 18 to 105. If you need that further reach, Tamron. There is a telephoto budget option of an older Sony lens if you are able to find one. It is the Sony 55 to 210 millimeter f4.5 to f6.3. Now this was released in 2011, so I know B&H Photo has them in stock right now, so it is still available in some places, and you can get it for around $300 USD. So to have a 55 to 210 for $300, it is a good way to go if you have a little bit less budget for a telephoto lens, but you still want to get some experience using that. It's also optically stabilized, so it will help you take your photos from a distance with the lens stabilization in there. So definitely something to consider as long as you can find one. Now, I will mention the Sony 70 to 350 4.5 to 6.3 because that's about $1,000, and for that focal range, that is actually, it's pretty good. It's just because that Tamron exists at the 18 to 300 for less, then that's the one I would go with. But that Sony, the 70, if you don't need that wide angle and you want extra reach, you want it to go to 350, and you're willing to pay a little bit more, then that Sony could be a good option for you as well. Now, I really do love using my Sony APS-C cameras, and you see with these lenses available that are not as expensive as a lot of the full-frame counterparts, you can get such great quality to price, and that is one of the reasons I love the system so much, and I'm so glad that it is continuing, and I hope you were glad that you watched this, and I also hope that this cleared up a little bit for you, and that there are some lenses on the list that you would think, that'll suit me, and then you will click on the affiliate link, because after all, I need the money. I have bought a lot of lenses. Anyway, thanks for watching this. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.